Hello, everyone, colleagues all from across the region and across the world. Good morning, good afternoon for some. A warm welcome to all of you to this very, very important panel as part of this year's third Caribbean Conservation Finance Congress. And we have titled this panel, Conservation Trust Funds in Small Island Developing States, Aligning with National and International Commitments, MBSAPs, and beyond. I'm your moderator, Olita Williams, and I am extremely happy to be here with all of you joining from a rainy Guyana today to talk about a topic that is not only important for us as a region, but for us as individual countries, as islands who share unique geography, and as a result, specific vulnerabilities as well. So I'm attached to the Protected Areas Trust in Guyana, which is Guyana's only national conservation trust fund. And together with our partners, we work to co-finance Guyana's national protected area system. We signed a partnership agreement with the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund in 2022, and it has been an absolute pleasure working with such an incredible team since then. So let me tell you a little bit more about this panel. It is no secret that small island developing states are among the most vulnerable to climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental degradation. Yet we're stewards to some of the world's most important and richest ecological systems. These nations have demonstrated leadership in advancing sustainable development, but sometimes things like chronic financing gaps, institutional challenges can sometimes constrain progress. Conservation trust funds across the small island developing states have become critical instruments for delivering sustained country-led investment in biodiversity and ecosystem management. And I really wanted to pause and reflect on the term country-led investment, which is really a hallmark of the work that conservation trust funds do around the world. But at the same time, SIDS are under increasing pressure to be aligned with international commitments, such as their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, which we all know to be the MBSAPs, the Global Biodiversity Framework, and even the Sustainable Development Goals. So we want to be able to explore today how conservation trust funds are helping to bridge the gap between high-level policy ambition and on-the-ground implementation in the context of SIDS. So I welcome you all once again to this very important panel. Colleagues, you must know that we have interpretation for this panel in both Spanish and French, so feel free to utilize as needed. There is also the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. As we go along, please feel free to enter your questions because at the end of it, we really want to have a very interactive discussion. While we will hear from our panelists in a few, we also want to hear from you. And if you have any case studies, please feel free to share with us as well. So let me touch a little bit again about the key objectives of this panel. There are two things I want us to all keep in mind. One, we want to showcase the strategic role of SIDS-based conservation trust funds when it comes to supporting national biodiversity goals and international frameworks. And two, we want to explore practical pathways to enhance coordination, financing, and policy integration across the SIDS. So this, in essence, are our two key objectives as we maneuver over the next 90 minutes. So let's get straight to it. At this time, I am so pleased to be joined by three very capable and knowledgeable panelists on this topic. And the first question which I will pose to each of them is, in their opinion, how have conservation trust funds been contributing directly or maybe indirectly to helping countries meet their national and international biodiversity commitments? First up, we have Ms. Rulita Thomas, who is a climate and environmental policy expert with over 21 years of experience in natural resource management. She is currently the climate ambassador for Antigua and Barbuda and is also the Deputy Parks Commissioner at the National Parks Authority. So, Rolita, we welcome you to this panel and invite you to make your intervention at this stage.
Good morning, and good morning to everyone online. I bring you warm greetings from the Nelson's Dockyard National Park in Antigua and Barbuda. I am Rolita Camacho Thomas. I live in a protected area, and I'm going to make my remarks from my background as a natural resource manager for over 21 years. And what conservation funds have been doing and the change between before they were conservation funds and when they're conservation funds. So I'm going to talk a little bit broadly. So first of all, I am pleased that conservation funds exist, and from the background of being responsible for biodiversity management in a government agency, over the past 20 years, there have been various challenges in implementation. Government cannot do it all, and it is important that when we go out and to agree to international commitments through MEAs, that we have public support. The NBSAP process actually has helped to define our priorities as a country, and through that process, we have, as government, been able to align our projects and programs that government is implementing. I think for government, though, there's always a scarcity of, one, the human resources to implement, and two, access to the financial resources and the management. And just because government systems are very complex and highly bureaucratic, sometimes government cannot be as agile as natural resources management requires us to be, and cannot be as responsive. Policy takes time, legislative processes take time, and so conservation trust funds and conservation financing through trust funds that have a more agile and dynamic framework and structure can respond sometimes more quickly than government. And I'll give a few examples of how the length of time of responsiveness. So in Antigua and Barbuda, we started to develop environmental legislation way back prior to 2004. And this came out as part of the OECS NEMS. This is the National Environmental Management Strategy that all OECS member states were supposed to do. And so we started that development of our environmental regulations all the way back there. However, they were not, we did not finalize that process until 2015. But by 2015, as you can imagine, things were changing rapidly. And so by 2019, there was the need for review. In that interim, we had our Conservation Trust Fund, who was able to be more responsive to issues like sargassum management, issues with plastic waste disposal, and could really assist the government in implementing strategies and policies which were backed by government legislation, but which the line agency did not have the flexibility to do. On the flip end, though, I would like to bring up another issue, and that is where when funding is coming into the country, but not the implementation and the actions being delivered are not aligned to any policy. And this is a frustration that I've heard in community organizations and stakeholder groups, that they are not getting the support that they need from government. And I would suggest that sometimes it is because we have not gone through the process of realignment. And here's where I bring up the NEMS again, that the NBSAPs again, that the process of delivering an NBSAP or development of an NBSAP is really a critical process where all stakeholders who are involved in any type of conservation or natural resources management activity need to be involved in. it is important and critical that you're involved in the national planning process for actions for biodiversity management. The NBSAPs are not a government document that government alone is going to implement. This is meant to guide the country as a whole and part of the architecture, our national architecture and regional architecture for implementation of natural resources management priorities are conservation trust funds, and they are playing a bigger and bigger role. One, because of their management capacity and their organizational ability, but also because countries like Antigua and Barbuda, through government, do no longer have access to some funding streams. And so, in terms of the frustrations that I have heard from community groups, it is because of misalignment. And I've said so before, and I know it's quite controversial, but sometimes NGOs just act for advocacy, but on the other hand, government needs help with implementation. Government really needs help with implementation. And more, a lot of funding is being channeled through NGOs and CBOs. And I think there would be better synergies and alignment if we looked at our NDCs and identified priorities. Now, this does not negate the community-based activities that may not have been a part of an NBSAP, because there is adaptive management. There are impacts that happen that could be that need for agility that I spoke about earlier. So there is the need for agility, and that is where the responsiveness comes in. But I think the core programs and core strategies to prevent frustration across the system and to bring people working in natural resources management closer together in terms of our implementation and to have outcomes and results. The idea of alignment of priorities or the relationship between what you are doing as a priority and what the government has already set as policy is important. I think the other important thing in terms of the value of conservation trust funds is that the Caribbean has been accused of not being able to deliver on outcomes. And I think this is a complicated issue. I think there's part of this issue that has to do with the outcomes not being realistic in terms of our risk framework, our storms, climate change impacts, chloral bleaching, etc., kind of moving the goalposts for us all the time. But I do think that some of the rhetoric on us not being able to achieve outcomes is that we do not have aligned strategies for implementation. Conservation trust funds can't do it alone, and government can't do it alone. And I think the framework of a common policy, such as the NBSAPs, that can help to make sure that both the private and NGO world is walking alongside the government policy could help us to overcome this idea that we do not deliver on outcomes. There are also lessons to be learned from creating unrealistic expectations. There are lessons to be learned in terms of undervaluing the investments that need to happen in natural resources management to actually have outcomes. And I think I can point to examples in my area in terms of what the protected areas management figures are and what the actual reality is on the ground. So there are lots of issues, but safe to say that management of our biodiversity requires collaboration between and National Conservation Trust funds, private NGOs, community, and government. And if we are to actually counter some of the threats and the risk and respond and help to change the trajectory that biodiversity loss is happening, that we will have to come together around some common frameworks and help and deliver together. So I'll end it there. I'm sorry, it was a lot, but I welcome any questions and feedback, and I look forward to the presentation from my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Relita. What an excellent start to this panel, and thank you for such a interesting perspective and realistic one as well. I love the way you started by saying she's happy that conservation trust funds exist. And I know many of us are. So if you are happy as we are, please make a note of it in the chat. Let's be sure to share the love for conservation trust funds and the work that they are doing around the world. Just a reminder to everyone again that we have the question and answer box at the bottom. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them there as we go along. All right, so moving along very nicely, I have the pleasure of introducing our second panelist, Kate Brown, who is the Executive Director of the Global Island Partnership since 2009, and she's actually joining us from New Zealand. So there is a huge time difference right now, just after 2 a.m. in the morning. So you can tell the commitment, and we thank you so much, Kate, for being here with us. So Kate, I have the same question for you. Just tell us, in your opinion, how conservation trust funds are really contributing directly to helping countries meet their national and international biodiversity commitments. Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Walita. Yeah, I really enjoyed Ambassador's presentation, and I actually was in Nelson Dockyard National Park last year during the SIDS meeting, and an amazing place. I think I'm gonna just present some slides to because I'm going to talk a little bit about history. But as you mentioned, until I started working in GLISPA in 2009, but actually before that, I spent about 8 or 9 years working on MBSAPs in the Pacific with Pacific Island countries, and starting the process of working with the Caribbean as we work together to develop the program of work on island biodiversity that is within the CBD. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about GLISPA's history because it's very tied together with this subject that we're talking about today, and then some things that are happening that I think really point to the significance of the MBSAP in this process. I think one of the things that we're really good at as people is jumping to the next shiny thing. And at the moment, I think, we see conservation trust funds as really critically important to the challenges that SIDS in particular are facing. But there is also kind of the opposite thing of the burden of expectation there. And I think the connection to the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan and the idea of how government and all these other institutions and entities work in concert to actually implement things is really critical. So just going to share my screen. Yep. So this is just, so GLISPA is an island platform led by islands. And the reason I wanted to touch on this is because we were formed a little bit for the same reason that the subject of this webinar is on. We're really formed to look at how islands can mobilize political leadership around political commitments, how they can work together to implement them and really try to accelerate implementation of the program of work on island biodiversity, which was advocated for by island parties back between about 2001 and 2006. So yes, very back history. And it was these original kind of leaders of GLISPA that really pushed for this to happen back in 2005, 2006. So some of them obviously in the Caribbean, the Grenada and the British Virgin Islands. The reason I just talked about that is because I did a timeline, and I think this timeline puts into context. This is like GLISPA's timeline, and it's also the timeline of some of the things that we're talking about here. I think that with a lot of the conservation trust funds that we work with, you can't see them in isolation from political commitments that were made, and which some of them were formed to support, and others were repurposed to support commitments made. And I think what is happening in this timeline, if we look at, for example, in 2006, when the program of work was adopted, there was a political commitment made by Micronesia to the Micronesia Challenge, which was a large 20% terrestrial and 30% marine conservation target back in 2006. And Grenada at the same time made a big marine protected areas commitment in the same kind of an event. GLISPA traditionally has done a lot of high-level events in the margins of the CBD COP and other places to try and show where islands, in particular SIDS, are able to make political commitments, which are really illustrating their National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan or some element thereof, but in trying to give that space. So when the Micronesia Challenge launched, it actually decided, the countries decided to repurpose the Micronesia Conservation Trust to be the trust fund for the challenge. And then we see a trajectory also in the Caribbean. Back in 2008, something called the Caribbean Challenge was launched, which was kind of the response of the Caribbean to what Micronesia had done. And then by 2013, the Caribbean Challenge had actually become the Caribbean Challenge Initiative. And the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund was actually formed to support as linked to that, but actually now existing separately to that. So it was originally the mechanism for the fund mechanism for the Caribbean Challenge, and as we see by 2020, the Caribbean Challenge has kind of evolved into something else, and you'll see that by 2025 we see Actioning Blue launched, and which is kind of the new version of that, in which Caribbean Biodiversity Fund is actually the secretariat for that. So you see, you can't look at the Caribbean, even the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, in isolation from all of these things and this political commitment and this link to both the CBD process and obviously national biodiversity strategies and action plans are, the national strategy and perspective that links up into that global process. So we see that. I'm going to talk a little bit in the next slide about some of these other things that are in here, like SACAT and the Niue Ocean-wide Trust, because they're all now part of a community of practice on SIDS Conservation Trust Funds that was just launched last year at the last CBD COP in Curitiba. But the point is that all of them were created, including SACAT. If you look there, SACAT, which is the Seychelles Climate Change Adaptation Trust, was created after the Seychelles debt swap in Paris in 2015. And so it sort of evolved through that process. And the same thing with the Niue's ocean conservation commitments and process that it launched in 2022. It also had a trust fund that is associated with that political commitment. And I think we often kind of just focus on the fund, or we just focus on the political commitment, but it is an ecosystem rather than separate things. And I think it really touches on what the ambassador talked about, which is how something like a national biodiversity strategy and action plan and giving a platform for political commitments to be made by islands are really critical for this move towards implementation. And I think, a lot of this stuff has happened because in 2006, when the Island Biodiversity Program of Work was adopted, there was a lot of concern that implementation in islands would wouldn't would need to be supported and facilitated through the process. And so that's kind of one of the reasons why GLISPA exists, but also is one of the reasons why you see all of these political commitments on one platform. It's just that kind of momentum, I think, that we see that islands have. And so we're as I said, in 2024, as you can see on this timeline, and there's some other challenges and other things in here, but I'm really not going to focus on them. But the Conservation Trust Funds Community of Practice was launched in last year, and it really responded to the recognition that, particularly in SIDS, the conservation trust funds can play an outsized role in supporting implementation. What we've kind of seen is that a lot of these political commitments were really driving things, and now what you see is a lot greater support at both national level and regional level from things like conservation trust funds to really support that momentum. So it's kind of more of a symbiotic relationship, I think, than perhaps we perceived in the earlier period. And then just wanted to touch on, as I was just talking about, the SIDS Conservation Trust Fund Community of Practice that was launched. So we had the first meeting of this, the first workshop in the margins of the UN Ocean Conference in Nice with, you know, the Seychelles Climate Change Adaptation Trust, the New Ways Ocean-Wide Trust, the Micronesia Conservation Trust, and the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. We were joined also, and I think Leandra is on here, by Belize Fund for a Sustainable Future, and a few other organizations that are in the process of developing either national or regional conservation trust funds in SIDS. I really want to acknowledge kind of a lot of thought leadership on this stuff from Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. And I think what we kind of recognize together is that particularly SIDS Conservation Trust funds have a lot to learn from each other. They play an outsized role in the places that they work, particularly in supporting, this mix of what this discussion is about, which is about both the political commitment, but also the implementation side of the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. Those things can always be strengthened, and I think that's a little bit of the focus of this community of practice. But the community of practice did identify a few things that they wanted to work on together. And there have been some exchanges already. Last year, Seychelles went to Micronesia, which is very far. And I think, as we look at a global space where we do believe that resources are going to be more constrained, the working together to think about how to mobilize those are going to be really important. So some of the challenges that conservation trust funds identified that they wanted to work on together, and so these are the three priority things that this community of practice will initially focus on, driven by its members, which is on capacity building for governance, management, and transparency. So really a strong thing there. How to leverage the private sector within SIDS regions, kind of looking at how to do that, especially, in many places, a very limited private sector. And then the issue I was just touching on about accessing international public financing. So both looking at what the things going on at the global economy scale mean, what is the institutional readiness of some of these places to meet global fund requirements, and then how can international private sector and philanthropy fill the gap? So those are questions that we're going to work on between conservation trust funds. And anyone that is a SIDS Conservation Trust Fund is actually welcome to contact us if you are interested in more information about this. And then the second part of this Conservation Trust Fund community practice is really looking at international advocacy. And so that's looking at how SIDS in particular, but in this instance, the trust funds have a seat at the table for development and trial of completely new and or re-innovating of specialized financial instruments. And so we see that's been happening quite a lot. And then also the role, as we talked about, one of the priorities is looking at the role of conservation trust funds in developing and implementing national policy. So how they can support MBSAPs and NDCs, which is also what we're talking about in this panel. And then there's some other things. Some other things around the ongoing kind of drain on knowledge of some of these conservation trust funds. I think that where they really want to support others to thrive and I think really how their intellectual property and the things that they've been able to do are kind of respected and supported over time. And then this is just some pictures from that. So you'll see some familiar faces. There was a few Caribbean Biodiversity Fund folks here. At the bottom picture is the people involved in the various conservation trust funds from SIDS. So I think, in conclusion, we see sorry, I wanted to touch on this as well. One of the things that we recognized in GLISPA, so GLISPA traditionally did exactly what we're talking about in this thing, but we decided to launch a new Island Biodiversity Coalition after the CBD COP last year, really looking at, if we go back to what I said GLISPA was formed for and all those political commitments that were made, we want to try and elevate and reestablish island leadership in the CBD process. So looking at how we have increased visibility for islands there. And that links very strongly to implementation of national biodiversity strategies and action plans, but also the examples of island implementation that we were talking about, like Actioning Blue, like things that are going on in the Caribbean region. So if you want more information on getting involved in that coalition, which is really trying to think about a strategy for doing some of these things, please get in touch. And then here's my thing. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate. Yet again, another great presentation. And I really enjoy the historical context that you brought to the table, because we always need to remember that the successes of today were not automatic. They're really grounded on a strong foundation from persons who really believe that it could happen. So thank you very much for that perspective. And colleagues, again, for those of you who are interested in joining that community of practice, please continue to be engaged in the chat to let us know so we can be in touch for sure. All right, great. Moving along nicely. And last but definitely not least, colleagues, I am pleased to introduce to you another true friend of conservation trust funds from around the world. A Brazilian national, Dr. Adriana Moreira, is an expert in biodiversity conservation, climate change, and environmental sustainability. And she's currently the lead of the Global Environment Facilities Partnerships Division. So we are extremely pleased to have Adriana join us on this panel today. So Adriana, I have the same question for you as are all our colleagues. Tell us a little bit more about how conservation trust funds, from your perspective, are contributing directly or indirectly to helping countries meet their national and international biodiversity commitments. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Julita. Great pleasure to be here with you all in this amazing panel. Thank you for my colleagues for this very interesting presentations. I speak to you from warm Washington, D.C. But for a Brazilian, it's great. It's beach temperatures around the city and humidity also. But anyway, I'm representing the Global Environmental Facility, the GEF, and as you all know, the GEF has been actually a very strong partner for the conservation trust funds globally. The GEF has contributed to the creation of more than 62 now counting CTFs over the past 3 decades. And very important use of GEF resources as initial capitalization of these funds and leveraging the funding. The GEF is very pleased and honored to be the prime financial mechanism for the CDB, not only with the GEF trust fund that started after the conference in Rio 92. I like to say that the GEF is a carioca. The GEF was born in Rio de Janeiro after 92. And throughout this more than 30 years, we actually have had a strategy to support the creation of long-term financial mechanisms for conservation of biodiversity financing. And I think with this, I want to highlight one of the important benefits of CTFs that are crucial for the countries to meet all their targets in the global biodiversity framework and all their targets and commitments with the different conventions and also the climate convention, is the stability that these mechanisms provide throughout political transitions and economic cycles. I was very pleased to hear the ambassador talking from a protected area. Protected areas are in my heart, about exactly that. There is a picture of these areas before and after the CTFs, that they provide this, it's not a lot of funding, but it's a steady flow that builds throughout the years. I'm a true believer in incremental, evolution and incremental support. So I think this is one of the main benefits that the CTFs bring to the table, this stability and the relationship with governments and keeping a steady flow of financing to particularly the protected area systems. Another important aspect in this partnership with governments, particularly in meeting these commitments, and I think this is a very important aspect for the island states and other countries, is the relationship with donors, civil society, and local communities. The capillarity that the CTFs have, then sometimes the government are not able to reach those areas and the CTFs are there. So I think this capillarity, this interaction, this ability to provide small funding to local communities and indigenous peoples is another very strong aspect of the process of financing of CTFs. Also, the institutional memory and the expertise because of this long-term relationship. And this is something for me that's very close to my heart. I had the privilege to have established a few CTFs, particularly in Latin America, but also in Africa, to contribute to the, and these institutions are today, we created institutions that have been around now, many of them celebrating 30 years, 25 years. And to me, this is a very strong, how to say, evidence of success. The JEF more recently has established what we call the JEF CTF partnership. This is like an informal partnership that we have, particularly with the networks, that the REDLAC, the one in Latin America and Caribbean, CAFE in Africa, and we're really trying to connect with APNet in Asia. And this is part of this effort to revive this interest and to highlight the importance of CTFs as national mechanisms for long-term financing of biodiversity conservation. I like to say that the CTFs are like mini JAFs in each country. And this is a real important aspect of this long-term financing. I cannot stress them enough, the importance of them, But of course, we all face now, particularly the limitations of financing. And this is something my colleagues have mentioned about. I think we need to have a coalition through these networks to really push for more informed decisions at the level of the COP discussions on the role of CTFs. In this partnership with the CTFs, I was very, surprised to find out that the CTFs were very little known outside the circles of the networks, but not by like COP negotiators or by the CDB's secretariat itself. So I think one of the missions we have is to create more visibility, to create more knowledge, disseminate more knowledge on these amazing institutions and all the work that they've been done. And we have data for that. In an effort to fill this gap on information, we have made in this partnership a publication that I'm going to share with you in the chat after this little intervention, because I think this is a way, and the Jeff has been a partner on that. On the COP in Cali, we had a joint pavilion with the CTFs and the Jeff exactly as a way of improving this visibility, because CTFs mobilize international donors. They are a bridge with the national governments in this dialogue. They are a trusted partner in country for these discussions. Another very important aspect is that they relate with the private sector. It's always a challenge to have this relationship, and we have had many successes throughout the many different CTFs on this. I really would like to recommend you to take a look at the case of Mozambique, where they have been working very closely with the private sector with very strong results, and we can go on with many other examples. But I think they are all, I would say that they are part of the backbone of the global conservation financing for all these reasons that I mentioned. Very important partners for working to fulfill national, regional, and international commitments. I think I want to say, that the Jeff, as the original partner of CTFs, I would say, needs your support. We are going now through the ninth cycle. We are currently in the Jeff 8. Okay, the Jeff works in 4-year cycles. And we never had a more challenging context for doing a replenishment process that we are now for Jeff 9. But the good thing is, in the new strategy programming directions for Jeff 9, we are positioning CTFs as central and highly important mechanisms at the national and regional levels for implementing the commitments of the conventions that the Jeff serves as a financial mechanisms. This is being spelled out in the programming directions, and we are trying to really, discuss with donors the possibility of these very strong executing partners on the ground for the Jeff mission goals and objectives. I think with the more established trust funds, but also as a mechanism, as a conduit for a creation of new CTFs where they don't exist. I think in this dialogue, you know that the Jeff works with 144 countries. There are specific allocations per country, and the Jeff is very government driven. So the governments can make a decision to create an institution, can make a decision to create an endowment for that institution with the Jeff funds. I think the Jeff is still one of the few organizations that supports endowments, and that's very precious in the current context. Of course, many CTFs have been creating an array of that diversification of different sources of funding, but endowments remain a critical element, particularly for supporting the long-term existence of the executive part of the CTFs, of the institutions, and all the work they do. So I think this is a very timely discussion, the one we're having here, because it goes way beyond just the MBSAPs, but the plans and the link with the governments are very important. And I just wanted to close in saying that the Jeff wants to continue to be a champion of CTFs. And to start under JEF9, I think we can really have, with joint efforts on the JEF CTF partnership, a new wave. You know, we had a big wave on the late 90s, early 2000s, a new wave for capitalization of existing ones, creation of new ones. Another important aspect for the partnership is the CTFs as executing partners for JEF projects in country, because they have the dialogue with the government, they have the administrative and financial management capacity. You know, I think every country that has a CTF can think about the governments of using these institutions as their partners on execution of JEF projects. I think we have many different areas for collaboration and partnership to strengthen these crucial institutions on the global biodiversity architecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Adriana. Really, really enjoy that discussion as well. And it's not often that an entity can be likened to be called a mini Jeff. So I think that in itself speaks to the trust that you have and the organization has in conservation trust funds around the world. I also recognize your point on visibility. I know many of the colleagues here may not even be aware of their conservation trust funds in their countries. So please feel free to ensure you find out that information today. Leave a message in the chat. If you have it in relation to a question, you can post that in our Q&A as well. Thank you so much to the colleagues who've been answering to the questions in the chat so far. And Adriana, please feel free to share that link to the Jeff paper as well. I think Karen shared it earlier, but please add it to the conversation so everyone has some more information. All right, great. Let's continue this very interesting discussion. I think we're going along very nicely. Rolita, we haven't heard from you in a little bit. And so Rolita, a big part of national level biodiversity planning has to do with community-centered approaches. So I wanted to talk a little bit, or hear your perspective rather, on how conservation trust fund strategies ensure that community priorities as well as indigenous and local knowledge are being integrated.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would just like to reflect on some of the other interventions that have been made by panelists. I think this issue of innovative financing is not to be underlooked. I've worked in a protected area, and the financing that I've seen in project documents and the claims of how that's not what it is. It's grossly underestimated. And I think that we really have to be more realistic in terms of when we are talking about financing protected area management, we have to look at the economic sustainability, the sociocultural interactions and the benefits that are deriving, and what it will cost to actually build resilience in natural resources. But with respect to your question with respect to community involvement, you know, I have a different take. I live in a community that has been asked to be involved in protected area management. And so I have two hats on. So as a community member, particularly as a mother and a busy working woman, it is very hard to participate in the types of activities that are generally slated for community involvement. So the first thing I would say is let's not pigeonhole our ideas of what community involvement looks like in any box. Let us adapt community involvement depending on what the needs of the community are. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that I do not agree that just having community involvement is the goal. I think that awareness and sensitivity is one of the goals where you may have to have a certain level of involvement, but you also need to have the level of behavior change to be part of that involvement. So it's not community involvement to tick a box. but community involvement for an appreciation and understanding of the natural resources and the biodiversity that you're interacting to lead to behavior change if there's bad behavior, or to lead to sustained behavior if there's good behavior, and to understand that changes are happening in our environment and that as human beings, the impact of anthropogenic activities have a big deal to do with that. So I think that relationship, although it's a complicated relationship to understand, I find as a person who is in the community, who is being asked to be involved, and also a professional involved in the field, I feel that it can be very non-consequential, right? It can be just a ticker box exercise to meet some donor requirement, and I do not think that is valuable. I think community involvement needs to be more meaningful. In my community, the issue of getting historic information from our elders is important, especially in small islands where there's not a culture of documentation and data management. Sometimes the best data you can get is from your elders in the community. And sometimes that means going to church and sitting down and having a conversation, or going to the rum shop or the bar. And so let's not pigeonhole ourselves into what community involvement is. The second issue in terms of the delivery of outcomes and community involvements, we live in, and I'm sorry that I'm a controversial person, right? So I'm sorry if these comments are controversial. I think we need to do something different, which is why we are having this conversation. I think we live in an age of social media where everybody's an expert, and we have to be very careful that involvement does not drive decision making in a way that does not result in outcomes and worsens our problem with outcomes. Okay, so we have to really be careful that in terms of community involvement, we do have expertise guiding decision making, and it's not just, I want to do this, so I'll do it. Because everybody's an expert now, and we have to be really careful. And the other thing that I would say is that along those lines, all experts are not experts in your community. So it has to be a good balance of an interaction between an expert who is going to understand and interpret what the community is saying about their own natural resources and their own value of their natural resources, and then interpreting that back. I've seen too many times where consultants are coming in to do community work and they're ticking a box. Sometimes they don't even change the name of the country. They have a presentation and it's ticked and nothing happens. So I think that in the context of community involvement, the engagement needs to be more meaningful, and the engagement needs to actually listen to what the community is saying and not to prescribe or predetermine what actions the community takes. And there also needs to be an effort to educate the community on the basis of the science or the best practice. Maybe the community has a new best practice that is not in the book anywhere. And so for that, I think we need to really pay closer attention to how we engage in communities. And I also think that we have to understand that in the Caribbean context, community involvement is a political involvement as well. And the community doesn't only involve people who are living in the house, but it includes the private sector who are part of the community. It includes landowners that may be just trying to leverage their real estate potential. It involves the politicians. It involves the people who pass through the community and benefit from the resources of the community. So I think the definition itself of who the community is, who is utilizing, benefiting, and is interested in these resources has to be broadened. And I think I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Rolita. And sometimes not all controversy is bad. There are definitely good controversies. And this is also a critical matter that has to be discussed very openly and very candidly. So I really appreciated your feedback there. I recognize the importance of The one size fits all approach is not the goal, you know, and the importance of behavior change and recognizing who are true experts when we engage the community. Thank you so much for that. Kate, if you would like to jump in and add to that conversation, but also speak a little bit about some enablers and even some obstacles when it comes to aligning CTF programming with government priorities and international targets. Over to you.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, I think you know, the entire time we've been working on this, the community question, because I mean that's the critical space, isn't it? It's the people. It's always the people. How they can be engaged in a meaningful way that doesn't feel like it's just ticking a box in an exercise, you know, and that's sometimes what can happen with national biodiversity strategy and action plans, depending on how they're being developed. And then also, you know, the ongoing nature of their engagement and their ability to understand what progress is being made. I think those are all kind of critical issues to consider. I think also if you're in a community in many of the places everywhere, basically, you know, for the last 20 years, every 2 to 4 years, you get consulted about your national biodiversity strategy and action plan. It can feel like it's just a never-ending process without end, and I think that's the challenge for the government and for the people that are leading these processes, as Rileta said, to really to demonstrate kind of the value of what is being how those communities are being engaged and have that happen over time. And I think that leads to the point I really wanted to make about the connection between kind of these international processes and the role of conservation trust funds. You know, the whole thing, I think it's the word trust, which is in the middle of the words conservation trust fund. I think we often think about that from a financial perspective. So we think a trust fund is a financial mechanism, but actually the trust part is the critical thing. This is not just trust that the trust fund is going to disperse funds and those sorts of things, but it's the relationships that are created, and the ability of all of the different players, the government and different government agencies, because of course the government is not one block. It is one block, but it's not just one perspective. And then you have you know, other NGOs, you have other funders, you have all sorts of things. What we've always seen and what islands have always said is that is a real challenge, coordinating all of these different players and also all of the different people that want to work with any island. And I think our island colleagues on here can attest that want to work with any island on biodiversity and all the other gamut of things that people want to work on. And so I think this is where conservation trust funds, just from a capacity perspective, can play a really important role in trying to help with that coordination, and also to help with taking a more strategic approach to how engagement happens, both at country level, but also at the international level. None of a conservation trust fund cannot succeed without engagement of its community and the government, and being within some type of national framework and having a role in implementing that national framework, like a national biodiversity strategy and action plan. And I think this is where you see with something like Actioning Blue, for example, or previously the Caribbean Challenge Initiative, an effort to try and have political momentum that is backed up by actual real implementation that is happening, and of which more can happen. So, you know, that's the reason for mobilizing these large political initiatives. But yeah, I think I really come back to the idea that the trust, trusting the process, trusting the people that are involved, and investing in that is really critical to any type of success in this area. And I think you know, the reality is in the biodiversity space in islands, there's some real bright spots. There's some really great things happening, but our barrier or the challenge that we're facing is huge. And I think it was touched on by a previous speaker about the financing level, that the amount of finance that needs to go into into this work is huge, but is not connected to necessarily where we are at the international level and what we're talking about. And I think what I see is some real interesting opportunities, particularly for SIDS conservation trust funds. At the global level, if you look at what the Alliance of Small Island States is saying, both in, you know, financing conversations, there was a recent the Financing for Development meeting in Spain, and also in some other places, that SIDS in particular need to have a driving seat. They need to be at the table and have a driving seat in some of these conversations. And I really see an opportunity, because a lot of the really interesting stuff in both the finance side of things, but also implementation, are actually happening in SIDS, including in Caribbean SIDS. And so we need to not always think that of the barriers or the lack of capacity or the lack of funding, or, you know, the whole list of lacks that are faced, but really also what it is that is being contributed, and it is enormous. So, you know, to me, that's a different conversation, and it's a strong one as we move forward. So I really think that we can both at the international level change many of those conversations and try and bring some of those through lines that are happening in different processes into the biodiversity process. And I think, secondly, you know, the region, just to give an example, the region, when the Caribbean Challenge Initiative was launched in 2013, was also recognized as a biodiversity champion by the Convention on Biodiversity. So the Caribbean region was recognized for its contribution to this discussion, and that was before, you know, a lot of the huge efforts that have happened now. So I kind of encourage us to think about how some of these more politically motivated initiatives can support like local implementation, and then how conservation trust funds and the like can be the fundamental kind of glue for some of these things to actually happen. Because that's always the challenge, is consistency across time of people being engaged, and I think there's an opportunity there. So my encouragement to us is really to think how to have a big impact, to kind of get out of our own way a little bit on our thinking about where SIDS in particular are in the global space, and then to think about how we bring some of these stories and bright spots to strengthen that type of advocacy, and also to support things like Actioning Blue as it rolls out across the globe, across the region and across the globe, because that is a really good example of exactly what this session is about. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate. I would want to add there too that there's definitely no mistake that the word trust is in the term conservation trust funds. We are indeed a trusted financial mechanism for channeling funds to the right people in the right places and in the right amounts. And so that is a very important point. At this time, I think another area that has come up in all of the panelists' intervention is the word money and finances. And so at the Global Biodiversity Alliance Summit we were at last week that Karen mentioned during the opening ceremony, there was mention that, you know, conservation without money might just be a conversation. And so, Adriana, I wanted to talk a little bit about financing for impact. So given these resource constraints that we are hearing about, that many small island developing states faced, what innovative financial mechanisms or partnerships have you seen work to scale a biodiversity impact? Are there any models that you believe could be replicated across the regions?
Well, I thought we were going to continue with the community
Oh, of course,
conversation.
you can definitely add that
Because
as
I
well
wanted
too.
to, because this is something that it's very important, and this partnership for the Jeff as the uh, 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 presence of the CTFs on the ground. It's a very important link. I just want to make a quick reflection on that and then go to your question, Lolita, because I think to say like we need to focus on our goals as and the CTFs, they are financial institutions, different orders of magnitude, let's say, in the funding. But, I think there are three important concepts, and Kate just touched it in the trust aspect. I want, for me, in terms of funding, there are three. First, you need to think you as yourself or the institution as a catalyzer. So who are your partners on the ground? Who are your partners to achieve your objectives? So this is it's a very relevant element on thinking strategically, because we are not going to solve all the problems. When we work with communities, we have a myriad of demands that pertains to health, education, public works, and all of that. But as a trusted partner, and that comes the trust part of this, working with communities, you can be kind of a linking element in the discussions with governments to help bring their pleas. But this is, an element in the whole relationship. And so this catalyst role, they need to build trust. But I want to bring another aspect that's very relevant. It's our ability to manage expectations. And sometimes, when we come to a new project, these consultations that Ambassador Rilita mentioned continues, they go consult and they never come back with a response. Uh, uh, it's part of this process. They raise unfair expectations. So we need to reflect on this role of financial institutions that the CTF have, how to manage the communities and expectations. But in my experience with projects and programs on the ground, I think the best ones that had, now going into your impact question, that developed impact over time with sustainability were exactly the ones that involved the local stakeholders. I go beyond communities because it's not just the communities, like local governments are also very important in these aspects, and local private sectors, all of that in the dialogue ex ante during the preparation of the intervention. And at that to that aspect of successful project uh, delivery and delivering impact, I think the CTFs have an advantage for their presence on the ground. I think they need to position themselves to be partners of choice for the communities, for government to implement. And implementation is something that I think the delivery and the results that I have seen CTFs doing on the ground, they are masters of that. So I truly believe in this process. So looking at ourselves as catalyzers, building trust and managing expectations are key elements to work with all these groups of stakeholders, community, indigenous peoples, local governments, and else. In terms of the financing, I think, again, by position CTFs as these elements, and nationally, particularly, because I truly believe in the national CTF, have attracted a lot of money. But I think, in our publication, you will see one of the very interesting aspect is that the trust funds have been able to been very creative on the aspect of how to say diversifying mechanisms. So we have been, CTF as implementers of provisions from issues related to legislation on development programs. We have a lot of compensation management for that. Uh, and diversifying from the original approach of bidding an endowment or having long-term sinking funds to deliver projects for long-term conservation aspects, particularly in protected area management. But I think the new coming back of the debt for nature swaps, the CTF has a very important role now, for Latin America, for example, the IDB is establishing with Jeff support a facility for debt for nature swaps, where the CTFs have a central role as implementers, executors of the proceeds of the debt for nature swaps. So this is a way of diversifying the different streams of revenue to keep the CTFs going. Another aspect is the whole new financial products such as bonds, also this is an important element. In working at this local level with local partners can also be a way of diversify. What I want to say is that in my experience, CTFs have been some of the most creative institutions in terms of leading innovation for financing mechanisms, these return-based investments, economic instruments, this partnership with government for executing projects, as a prime partner for grants and other types of executing grants and other types of transfers. I really think we need to learn from each other. There is a lot of knowledge in the CTF networks. Some are leading on carbon offsets, others are leading on biodiversity offsets, impact investments. So I think we have a myriad of mechanisms that have been developed with CTFs as the lead innovators. And I really think this innovation is something that we should strive more, and particularly looking at this, the instability of some funding cycles that the CTFs can bridge the gap, is political and financial funding cycles, issues related to government budgets also. I think the CTFs are very important elements in bridging the gap for stable financing for the biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana. Yet again, another powerful intervention. Colleagues, we are just closing off. We have about 15 minutes remaining. I would like to encourage all of the participants, if you have any question, there is the question and answer box at the bottom. Please feel free to add a question there. We will not let you go until we have a question in there. So please feel free to add anything at all you might be interested in asking. I will ask all of the panelists at this time to open their camera if they can, and I will pose the final question as we seek to wrap up and just bringing it back into the topic at hand for our panel. So our final question, as we wait on the other questions from the participants, to all of you, if you had one strategic ask to accelerate progress on a country's MBSAP or even any biodiversity plan in platform implementation through an NCTF mechanism, what would it be? and who needs to be at the table to make that happen. So a strategic ask and who needs to be at the table. I will go with Rolita first.
Alignment.
Sounds good.
I think it's very simple. I think there needs to be greater alignment. And I think there needs to be more coordination. The relationship between NCTFs, government, private sector, community. I think the community relationship is fine, but I do think that the relationship between government needs to be strengthened. I would say that the performance of the regional NCTFs are drawing the attention of government to the importance of NCTFs, which I think is critical. And I think that through the ministries of finance who are dealing with government budgets, they are now coming and saying, hey, this NTCF, they're making waves. They can be agile. We can't do what they do. We need NTCFs to help us to implement our multilateral agreement commitments and our own natural resources management strategies and frameworks. And I think that is a credit to the NTCF and the dynamism and the, just the growth of the NTCF. And it opens up possibilities. That's one. And I think for the communication of the possibilities through an NCCF could work to strengthen that alignment, because government, I think for at least for my country, government's resources are strapped, right? So there's no budget other than the staff that are employed in the regulatory agencies that are responsible. There's no budget. And so even the relationship between the NTCFs and the line technicians to have a closer relationship in terms of coordination, technical support, I think all of that could really help in rolling out. I want to say something else though, because one of the issues that came up in the previous discussion is this issue of scale of financing. And I had brought up the issue of delivery of outcomes. I really think that we have to pay attention across the board on what we're promising. It has happened at the community level that we promise all of these things. We go in with a project and we promise all of these things and they're not done. We have to be careful what we're promising donors we can deliver as well. And what we're ticking in indicator documents as we can achieve this. No, you can't actually achieve it because there may be a hurricane and it's done as a risk and, it's not thought about, but it is actually a real thing. And there's a community of people who are working. So we have to really be careful about, I know we want to look like we can do the world and deliver the world, but we have to be more realistic and honest with ourselves. And I think that in this way, a strategic alignment with government priorities and going through that process, the engagement process of helping government to set these priorities under the existing multilateral environmental agreements aligns you with a legislative mandate, a government policy, and then a delivery mechanism. I really see the future of biodiversity delivery being through NTCFs and mechanisms like that, because government cannot do it. And there are some socioeconomic issues, particularly in Caribbean governments. There's crime, there's healthcare, there's education that does not have an NTCF to support it. And when governments become strapped for financing, continually having to respond to disasters, honestly, the NTCF, I think, are going to be one of the critical tools that government would say, hey, can you do this for me? And I really do think that we have to think about NTCFs as not just a community implementation. We have to think about NTCFs as scale level implementation. And that is why I'm encouraged to see it going there. And I want us to think about it like that. I'm sorry for the long answer.
No problem at all. That's fine. Very useful. Kate, do you want to jump in there for us?
Yeah, I think alignment is also critical, and coordination, because I think that this is about capacity. The conservation trust funds give increased capacity at national level and at local level to actually do things, but it can't work if it's not connected or coordinated to the national policy framework. So that is really critical. And I think my big ask would be around how to demonstrate impact of both the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which has always been a struggle in terms of how do you know, 5 years, 10 years down the track that actually anything has improved, or it's really difficult. I don't think that's something that we've really solved. But what are some of the key indicators that we could, that could be measures of that? So not necessarily trying to do everything, because I think the capacity thing is a reality, but like put some thinking into that. I think that, like, which is how to demonstrate impact. And when you're doing things with money, you have to show impact. Like that's the thing. And so there is a role, I think, there for conservation trust funds to work together, particularly, thinking as we revise MBSAPs and move forward, what is the impact of all of this activity and work? And not just at project level, but at national level. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kate. And Adriana, we have a question. So somebody has given us, I see at least one. We have one from Diana Lindo. So Adriana, just before you talk about that ask, I will also ask if you have any intervention on this question as well. So it reads, trust is vital, as one panelist said, but trust building must be intentional on the part of all partners. What intentional and strategic actions can trust funds and communities and government ministries take to build and maintain trust?
Well, Olita, on the previous question, I agree very much with my fellow panelists on the need for alignment and coordination and delivering impact. But I also believe very much on communicating results, okay? Because I think, again, we need to leave our bubbles. Ambassador Relita mentioned a very important partner in this. That's the Ministries of Finance. We tend to circulate around Ministries of Environment and our environmental related issues. And a very big discussion with Ministries of Finance is what we're being calling policy coherence. We tend, to, we have an expression in Portuguese that says, we are like always trying to dry the ice, and the ice, in our warm weather keeps pouring water, because if we don't tackle in our own countries and regions these different aspects of investment, we are in the business of drying ice all the time, because what we have is that, we are working so many years in one area trying, and then you have a development project that has a high level of subsidy from the government that is in the wrong place, all of those things. This is part of the policy coherence, where the government budgets are going, where we are financing. So I think for me, this is one next big area for us of discussion. And I think, I want to leave a challenge here, because I think the island states have a big lead on this. Why? Because you are small. Okay, I come from Brazil. That's very hard to do in my country. There's a huge bureaucracies. You are small, each other. So how can we talk and convince, and how can we bring this? Because I think the SIDS can really deliver on that. This strive for policy coherence, this alignment and coordination. Maybe, I'm a newcomer to this community. I work a lot with very large countries and very large economies. But I think you guys have a great advantage on that, and the coalition that the SIDS have built. I'm a big fan of GLISPA and all the coalitions of the island states, and how you were making your voice heard globally. So it's a position of advantage. And I think, leading on that, on the implementation of your NBSAPs and this alignment, you can really deliver impact. And the Jeff wants to be part of that, whatever we can do to support that. Thank you. The question of trust is exactly what we're trying to do here. I think, this is an example. In my experience, building trust is also part, particularly with communities, as an ambassador mentioned it very clearly, and Kate also did. You have to acknowledge their, struggles, but also their successes. And this is the process of building trust. We are humans. All these institutions are made of humans, people. So I think in her question about how to build trust and how to maintain, you have to have an intentional position of as an active listener, of acknowledging the different skills and attributions and positive aspects of the institutions involved, and is also maintaining dialogue. I think at least in my experience, you can never come, particularly working with a ready-made solution that you're trying to impose. It doesn't work. But if you, through the dialogue, through the open dialogue, through this ability to recognize the efforts, you will start building up and bringing elements for capacity building of these different groups. And it's in all levels. Governments also need capacity building. They are not ready. They're not, so you are able to move the needle. I've seen that done, but it needs this effort. You need active listeners on all sides, and you need champions. You need to identify the champions for this trust building across the institutions. But I really believe on this process. It takes time, but we also need to look back and see how much we achieved, and you have achieved so much, and we need to show the world that you have done that. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Adriana. So in these last 3 minutes of our panel, let me remind everyone of our objectives that we started with at the beginning. One, we wanted to showcase the strategic role of small island development states conservation trust funds when it comes to supporting national biodiversity goals and frameworks. And I believe that we have done that. Our panelists have really highlighted our role very clearly. We're seen as responders, agile responders, innovators. We're seen as stable, trustworthy. We're seen as catalysts, as being creative, and ultimately partners of choice. We had the second objective where we also wanted to explore some practical pathways to enhance coordination and financing, and also policy integration. Our panelists yet again have talked about the establishment of that community of practice, establishing or engaging with communities in a more intentional and strategic way, and not just ticking that box, as Relita rightly said. We heard about diversifying mechanisms, and we also heard about learning about the various funding cycles of our donors and governments to understand when might be the best time to engage. So overall, colleagues, thank you so much for joining today's discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. Please stay connected. Again, we have much more to go for the Congress, and I know my colleague Craig will be hosting the next panel, and so I invite all of you to join that. It's at 12:30. It's titled Strengthening Caribbean Conservation, Synergies Between Conservation Trust Funds, and yet again, we're talking about the Jeff there. So please join that conversation as well. To the wonderful panels, it was a pleasure moderating your session today, quite insightful. And we will definitely be in touch. It does not end here. We continue the conversation. See you all at the next session.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all that you do.
Thank you.
Really,
thank you,
this
Lisa.
group of
Thank
women. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank
Everyone.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Get some
Take
sleep,
care.
Kate.